So thus far in the auditory unit, we've talked about what sound is and the dimensions on which it varies. We've also talked about how sound is transduced into neural code and how we distinguish between high-pitched sounds, low-pitched sounds, loud noises, and quiet noises. Today, we're going to start talking about how the auditory system makes sense of those input, makes sense of what we're hearing. So how does it combine multiple frequencies together? This is more about how we listen to sounds kind of out in the wild, in natural kinds of scenes. So how do we sort out the sources that the frequencies we're hearing are coming from? How do we turn, oh, I hear 3000 hertz and 1500 hertz for 15 milliseconds into, that's an oboe and it's playing a waltz? So to start, I want to play you a complex auditory scene. What I mean by that is that it's stimuli coming from multiple sources happening simultaneously. Listen closely and try to identify as many different individual sources that are in this auditory scene as possible. Okay, listen. Okay, so you think you heard probably like a chainsaw and a violin and a cash register and a baby and a car horn and a crowd cheering. This is a very complex auditory scene. It's having auditory stimuli coming from lots of different sources. And each item, the chainsaw, the violin, the crowd cheering, are producing a set of frequencies. Each of those things we call a source, and they're each producing different frequencies all simultaneously. Okay, next I'm going to show you a spectrogram of the same scene so you can see all of the frequencies that are simultaneously present. Here's what it looks like. So note that at any point in time, you're hearing a single slice of this auditory scene. You're hearing lots of different frequencies associated with lots of different sources. So I heard a violin is something that your brain assembled from all of those frequencies that are happening simultaneously. So that's really amazing. Even though all of these sounds are being received by the ear at once and processed simultaneously, we perceive them as though they're coming from separate and independent sources. So this is the realm of auditory scene analysis. It's the process by which an auditory experience, an auditory scene, is split into its component perceptual parts. Now, the thing that makes this so remarkable is that all of the waveforms from all of those different sounds are arriving at the ears at the same time. Right? So if we go back to our schematic that we had last time of activity on the basilar membrane, it could be that the violin is producing this signal and the baby crying is producing this signal and the chainsaw is producing this signal. But what reaches the tympanic membrane, and therefore what gets coded in the cochlea, is the combination of all of those things happening simultaneously. So despite the fact that the brain is sent this, what we perceive is this. So the question is, how do we go from simultaneous activity at lots of different regions in the basilar membrane to the unique perception of these different sources? So this is the realm of auditory scene analysis, how the system takes the mixture of sound that it derives from a complex natural environment and sorts it into separate auditory streams, identifies what sources are making those different sounds. As a visual analog, imagine I gave you this to try to read. And what you were able to do is separate that out into a number of different sources. So this is exactly what the auditory system is doing, taking a big, messy, complex auditory scene that's coming from lots of different sources and breaking it up into its component parts. Today we're going to talk about 4 types of auditory grouping cues. These are heuristics or shortcuts that the auditory system uses in order to try and identify which frequencies go together. So the first auditory grouping cue we're going to talk about relates to what you read about for class. Things are more likely to be grouped when they come from the same location. And we'll talk about location in 3 different realms. Azimuth, which is like location in the horizontal plane around you, elevation, how high or low the sound is coming from, and distance, how far away it is. Now, there are clear evolutionary reasons to know where sounds are coming from. Right? If you hear a twig snap in the night, you hear a growl, you want to know where it's coming from so you can orient and protect yourself. And it turns out we're pretty darn good at making sense of where things are coming from. And to do that, we use two different classes of cues. The first type of cue we'll talk about are those that you read about, the binaural cues, where we're comparing input from our two ears in order to try and localize things in space. And binaural cues are great for figuring out where things are in the azimuth. We'll also talk about monaural cues, or cues that you only need one ear to be able to use. And those can be used to identify locations of sounds in azimuth and elevation and for distance. So we can use the binaural cues that you read about by comparing the intensity of the signal reaching both ears and the timing of when it reaches both ears. So for instance, if I have a sound coming from over here, it's going to be louder in this ear than in this ear, and those sound waves are going to reach this ear before they reach this ear. So by comparing the input that reaches both of our ears and saying, how loud is it over here? How quickly did it get over here versus over here? We can figure out where the sound is in space. Hey, you ever wonder why we have these lovely little folds of flesh on the sides of our heads? Everything we've talked about in the auditory system so far would be just as well served, would work just as well if we just had holes in the side of our heads, right? But we have these pretty little things. We have these dainty little skin folds here. So one reason for this is that the shape of our pinna can help us provide monaural, that is single ear cues about sound localization. Having our ears be the distinctive shape that they are helps us localize things in the azimuth and determine the elevation of sounds. So depending on where sounds come from, they'll be reflected differently by the pinna by the time they reach the tympanic membrane. Okay, so imagine the following situations. Let's say sound is coming directly from the level of the external auditory canal. In that case, hey, never put anything in your ears, okay? Okay, in that case, it just goes straight into the external auditory canal and contacts the tympanic membrane without any bouncing around or reflecting. But if the sound comes from below, it's going to hit this part of the pinna and reflect into the external auditory canal and have to kind of bounce around a fair amount before it contacts the tympanic membrane. If it comes from up above, it may hit right here and then bounce in a different way. So the key idea is that depending on where the sounds are coming from, they're going to get reflected into the external auditory canal at different angles and therefore bounce around in the auditory canal in different ways before finally contacting the tympanic membrane there. All right, so let's imagine a sound that has a flat frequency curve. That is, it is the same intensity at all of these frequencies. So the true nature of the source is represented here by the black line. But if that source is presented from above the head, so this is the blue line now, the higher frequencies are attenuated, are reduced more than the lower frequency ones. If, however, the sound is coming from below the head, so this is the red line, the mid-range frequencies are the most reduced, and all of the frequencies are reduced more than if they had come from above the head. So what that means is that for the same exact sound, the frequencies that reach the tympanic membrane are different depending on where they came from. And over the course of our lives, we have unconsciously learned those patterns. We've learned that things sound different depending on where in azimuth or in elevation they are. So how do we know that these patterns are learned? Well, for one, we can change them in real time. Researchers have changed the shape of the pinna by asking participants to wear silicone molds in their ears for several days. When they first put them in, the molds completely wrecked the participants' ability to localize sound using monaural cues. But they keep wearing them for several days, they learn and adapt, and they begin to be able to localize using those monaural cues again. Guess what happens when the molds come out? They're bad at it again, and they have to relearn. All right, so we've covered azimuth and elevation, but how do we know how far away things are? Think about this for a second. When you hear a sound, how do you know if it's coming from very close to you or very far away from you? The cues we use in order to estimate distance are monaural because you don't need to compare the input from both ears to be able to use them. But they also don't rely on pinna shape. These you could use even if you just had holes in the side of your head. One of the ways that we know how far away things are by comparing sounds to one another. So that's called relative intensity. If you hear a dog bark and then a minute later you hear the same dog bark but it's much quieter, that's a good cue that it's getting farther away. We can also use our prior knowledge about what things should sound like, the intensity they should have, that is familiar intensity. So for example, you know what your phone sounds like. And if you heard your phone much quieter than you usually do, that's probably a good signal to you that it's farther away. So familiar intensity is about comparing what you hear to what you know it is supposed to sound like at a given distance. And finally, we can identify how far away things are based on their spectral composition. Low frequency sounds travel more robustly than high frequency sounds. So high frequency sounds attenuate pretty rapidly as they travel through space. That's why foghorns, whale calls, other noises that are supposed to travel a really long distance are low pitched. So if we hear something that sounds lower pitched than it should, it may be because it's far away and high frequency sounds are attenuated. Now, humans can be pretty good at localizing sounds in space, but some people can get incredibly good at it and basically use these localization cues to echolocate and identify the locations of objects in space. So what that means is that they produce sounds that are then reflected off objects and come back to them. And by hearing things about how those sounds are reflected, they can figure out where things are in space. I'm going to show you a video of a man who could do just that.
I have been echolocating for as long as I can remember. If my parents think back, I lost my first eye at 7 months, my second eye at 13 months. I was probably clicking by the age of 15 months. So I don't remember learning to click. I don't remember really learning to echolocate. Around here there's not, lots and lots to detect, but immediately there's this pylon here. And there it is. And then there's an object about 20 feet away here, and another one about, 50 feet away. The process of echolocation in humans is very similar to the process in bats. In fact, it's virtually identical. The physics is the same. We're talking about airborne sonar either way. A bat can detect an object the size of a gnat from, so many meters away. For me, the object has to be at least the size of a softball. We tend to teach the use of a discrete tongue click, which can be as quiet as, or as loud as, or even louder as need arises. And it's like seeing with dim flashes of light.
Okay, so our goal here is figuring out what things come from the same sources. And one really good clue that things are coming from the same sources is that they're coming from the same location, right? We don't ever hear an instrument that is coming from multiple places simultaneously. Another good clue that things are coming from the same source is that they are close together in frequency. So I'm going to play you a few different sequences of sounds, little beeps and whistles, and I want you to decide whether it sounds like each of them are coming from one source or multiple sources. That is, are you hearing two things that are happening simultaneously, or are you hearing just one stream? What people typically report is for this top one, that when the sounds are close together in frequency, it sounds like they're coming from the same source. It sounds like just one thing. When the sounds are farther apart, it sounds like they're coming from two sources, that there are two different streams that are happening simultaneously. So here's a nice demonstration. I'm going to play you a familiar melody that has a series of distractor notes played simultaneously. And at first, they're going to be very similar to one another in pitch. So this is represented by that top panel. It's basically going to be like you're hearing the melody and you're hearing distractor notes that are a very similar pitch. Then, with each successive presentation, the melody is going to get slightly higher pitched than the distractor notes. At some point, when it is sufficiently different in pitch than the distractor notes, your auditory system is going to start parsing those as two different streams, and the melody is going to become clearer. So listen closely and try to identify what the familiar melody is. Okay, so it was Mary Had a Little Lamb. If you didn't get it by the end, go back and listen now. Use that top-down information that you know what the melody is and see if that helps you pull it out on that last presentation. Okay, so remember, the goal here, the goal of auditory scene analysis is figuring out which sounds are coming from which sources. So when the melody and the distractors are close in pitch, we hear one source. So we can't tell what the melody is because we're combining together the distractor notes and the melody notes. When they start to become farther apart, we hear it as two sources, one of which is distinctly melody. And so that's when it becomes possible for us to detect what the song is. So how do we know what's coming from what sources? Well, sounds that come from the same source are likely to come from the same location and be somewhat similar in frequency. Our third auditory grouping cue goes back to what we talked about on the first day of the auditory unit. Over the course of our lives, when hearing music and voices and other natural sounds, we have grown accustomed to the fact that frequencies tend to co-occur in regular patterns. We are used to hearing harmonics. So we make use of the fact that harmonics appear in consistent and regular ways. When input to the auditory system is a number of frequency bands that are all multiples of one fundamental frequency, it's a good cue that they originate from the same source. So if the auditory scene got something like what you're seeing on the screen, the system is likely to interpret this as a single stream coming from a single source. This is one chord. But if it looks like this, we're more likely to interpret it as two sources, right? There is not a single fundamental frequency that can produce all of those frequencies. So instead, we're more likely to parse it as two sources, one of which is creating all of the red frequencies that you see, and one of which is creating the blue frequencies. So to illustrate this, I'm going to play another demonstration. First, you're going to hear two repetitions of a single pure tone. Then you're going to hear that same pure tone embedded as the third harmonic in a chord. And probably what you're going to hear is when you hear that chord, the chord sounds like a single chord, a single note coming from the same source. But then all of the frequencies except the pure tone are going to shift down slightly until that pure tone is out of sync with the other harmonics in that chord. So at the very beginning of the chord, at the very beginning of the series, you're going to hear one stream. It sounds like a chord. But by the end, you're going to hear two streams. There's a chord plus the pure tone. Let's have a listen. So when it is conceivable that that pure tone is one of the harmonics in a complex chord, we hear it as a single stream. But when that chord gets sufficiently out of sync that it could no longer be one of those harmonics, now we start to hear it as coming from two different sources. Our last grouping cue has to do with timing. It is unusual that unrelated sounds would start or end or change at exactly the same time. I want to play the spectrogram from the beginning of class again, and I want you to notice how, when a new sound source starts, how many frequencies are affected simultaneously. So one good clue we have that sounds are coming from the same source is that they're moving together. They're starting together or moving together or stopping together. All right, here's a demonstration of that. You are going to hear three sections of sounds. In the first section and the last section, it's going to sound like one stream because all of the frequencies are possible harmonics of the same fundamental frequency. But then in the middle section, some of those frequencies are going to move together. Some of them are going to go wee wee wee, while the other ones maintain the same frequency. And what it sounds like is when all of the frequencies are flat and stationary, it sounds like one stream. But then when those middle ones start to move, it suddenly bursts into being two streams. You hear two different streams, one of which is changing, one of which is staying the same. Have a listen. Things that change together, hang together. So the challenge is that we hear lots of different frequencies simultaneously. And in order to understand what is actually out there, what are the objects in the world that are generating those sounds, we have to group them together in meaningful ways. And we can't just use the information that is coming from the sources in order to find what that meaning is. So we rely on prior experience. We rely on these top-down heuristics, these mental shortcuts that in the past have served us well in order to try and identify what's actually going on in the world out there. So we're using these different cues in order to help us make sense of and understand complex auditory scenes. It's problem set time. I'll see you in class. All right, as just one example, two locations that are very easy to distinguish between using binaural cues are 90 degrees, that means just to the right of me, and 180 degrees directly behind me. That's because those locations produce very different ILDs and ITDs. So when something is coming directly from the right side, that information is going to reach my right ear long before it reaches the left ear, and it's going to be much louder in the right ear than it is in the left ear. Whereas if a sound comes from directly behind me, it's going to reach both ears at the same time and be an equal amplitude in both ears. I just want to point out, when I say that the sounds will reach the right ear much faster, by that I mean 640 microseconds faster to get to the right ear than the left ear. Yeah, microsecond, that sounds small. What's a microsecond? It's a millionth of a second. To put this in perspective, a microsecond is to a second as a second is to 11 and a half days. A microsecond is tiny. And the biggest ITDs that we can possibly get are 640 microseconds. That's the time it takes sound to travel basically from one ear to another ear. But we can detect timing differences much smaller than that. So we're sensitive to timing differences of about a degree in perceptual space. So there's 360 degrees to get all the way around us, right? We can sense the difference between a spacing difference of 1 degree. And that timing difference of how long it takes something to get to both ears if it's directly in front of us or 1 degree off to the side, 10 microseconds. That is so fast. So when you hear sounds in space and you know where they are using timing differences, you're picking up on timing differences that are just infinitesimal. How cool is the auditory system? Sounds within the cone of confusion are shown in the same colors here. We can't distinguish between sounds at 60 degrees and 120 degrees because in both cases, they're getting to the right ear before they get to the left, and they're louder in the right ear than they are in the left. So how do we resolve sounds in the cone of confusion? We use our lovely flesh folds. Pinna shape matters. So I told you that pinna shape can help us localize not just in elevation but also in azimuth. So the way that we distinguish between sounds that are coming from locations within the cone of confusion is based on those different frequency signatures in how they reach the tympanic membrane based on pinna shape. Notice that it's called a cone of confusion, but it's worth noting that directly in front of you and directly behind you are also points within a cone of confusion. I once had a student jokingly refer to this as the mohawk of confusion, and I really like that because sounds that come from right in front of you get to both ears at the same time and are equally loud in both ears. Sounds that come from directly behind you are the same. But we can clearly tell the difference between sounds that come from in front of us and sounds that come from behind us because of pinna shape and how those frequencies reach the tympanic membrane based on how they're reflected by the structure of the external ear. All right, poor Susie. So her ILDs and her ITDs are still going to work, and her cues for distance will still work. But what's going to be impaired is that she will not be getting effective information about the monaural cues derived from pinna shape. So she's basically like a participant in the study that I told you about where she's wearing an artificial pinna that impairs her ability to localize using those cues. So she's likely to make errors between locations that are within the same cone of confusion. Because she can still use ILDs and ITDs, she can say it's definitely coming from either here or there, but won't be able to distinguish between those. What a tough day she's having. So having an ear infection restricts movement of the ossicles, so sound level is going to be reduced relative to normal. That means her interaural level differences are going to be the most impaired because she's going to have difficulty comparing the levels from the two ears because one is so much quieter. All right, so if you listen to that amazing virtual barbershop recording, it really sounds like the people are moving around and getting closer and farther. It really feels like they're actually in the physical space. So to make these recordings, you couldn't just set up a microphone and have people make noises around it because that wouldn't be able to identify location at all, right? You can't tell the difference between over here and over here. So to get ILDs and ITDs, you have to set up two microphones that are the same distance apart as your ears. So that way, if you have a fake head with two microphones in it, sounds that come from over here are going to be picked up by this microphone faster than this microphone. But that's still not enough because sounds that are within the cone of confusion would still be very easily confusable. So what do? To get those monaural pinna cues, you make artificial pinna. You make a fake head that has actual pinna, and you embed microphones where the tympanic membrane would be. This is actually how they make surround sound demos like that, with fake pinna. Okay, but at this point, people often say, yeah, but all of our ears are shaped a little bit differently, and that means that the frequencies that reach our tympanic membranes are all going to be a little bit different depending on our specific pinna shape. Yeah, that's true. However, human ears still have a lot in common with one another. So I don't know exactly if this is what they do, but my guess would be that when they make these kinds of recordings, they take a pinna that's like kind of average, and it's going to work better for people whose pinna is similarly shaped and less well for people who have dramatically different shaped pinna. Cool, huh? The comparison is that perception is an inference. In the visual system, we're making use of cues that we have acquired over the course of our lives, like that if you see two things that are similar and there's one thing that's obscuring them, the two things that are similar probably go together. And in the auditory system, we're using these environmental regularities that we've heard over the course of our lives in order to try and make our best guesses about the stimuli that are actually present. Things that occur in even multiples are usually harmonics coming from the same source. So if I hear something coming from even multiples, it's probably coming from one source. As in the visual system or any other system, those top-down assumptions that we make aren't always right, but we use them because over the course of our lives, they have been right more than they have been wrong. Thanks for listening. See you later.